Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Jeffrey Hull, and I'll tell you all about Jeff in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment, the compassion we feel toward others. And when you do it as a leader, and Jeff has been an advisor to leaders up and down the chain in many different organizations, you do it with a common cause to bring people together. Welcome, Jeffrey Hull.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
I want to tell everybody about you. First of all, you are Dr. Jeffrey Hull. You are the CEO of Leadership. You are also full-time faculty at Harvard University, and you're joining us from Amsterdam, where you have a home. So you are a highly sought-after speaker, consultant, and executive coach par excellence, and we will explore that because Jeff is one of the movers and shakers and of our practice, and he's very kind and generous to share his for us. So he's been featured everywhere, Harvard Business Review, not surprisingly, New York Times, Investors Business Daily, as well as all kinds of media. Welcome, Jeff. A pleasure to have you on the show today. So,
thank you. It's nice to be here.
You have a book that came out just last year called Flex, and you were telling me before air you were writing it when you were in Amsterdam. What prompted you to write the book, Jeff?
Well, I think the safest way to start that answer is to say that I had been itching to write about the evolution of leadership that I had been observing for about a decade. So it took me a while to get around to actually putting it on paper. But I also had the opportunity to work, as you know, at the Institute of Coaching, where we have a couple thousand coaches as part of our membership. And when I started to see big changes taking place in the practice of my own leadership coaching, I decided before I started writing about that, I should do some research, do some focus groups, and determine whether or not the kinds of changes that I was seeing were happening on a larger scale. And so that's what led me to survey coaches, interview a number of the members of the Institute. And that's when I came away realizing that there had been a huge sea change in the kinds of things that we as coaches were being asked to work on with our clients. Mm-hmm. And the clients themselves have evolved greatly in the last 10 or 15 years. And I really wanted to enumerate what some of those fundamental shifts that were taking place in the leadership space and how that was impacting organizations, how it was impacting coaches, and also how leaders could take advantage and leverage the skills that they needed to be more effective in today's world.
That's great. One of the beauties of your book is that it's got great stories and told very well. You write well, but it's based, as you mentioned, in heavy in research. So how has coaching changed? I just wanted to jump ahead. So what was it like? What were coaches being asked to do 15 years ago as opposed to being asked to do now?
Well, I would say that there's a couple of things that have fundamentally changed. One is that when we first started coaching, I have to admit, for me, it was more than 20 years ago. Most coaches either had some minimal coach training, which was just beginning to get formed with the International Coach Federation, or they came from a psychology background, which is what I had in my background. And so, coaching kind of evolved into a profession from psychology, from counseling. And it was only in the last 10 years or so that research into what works, what makes coaches effective, started to actually be funded through places like the Institute of Coaching that were studying coach outcomes. And that's when we started to get a sense of what really works. How do you help someone change? What prompts someone to have a goal, to change their practices, to achieve that goal, and to move on to another level of effectiveness as a leader? So the science, positive psychology, the neuroscience, a lot of different types of scientific endeavor and research are now underpinning what coaches are doing in a way that just didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago.
That's great. Good. Before we jump too more ahead in there, have you seen a shift in leadership as well, say from when you started to what you see now? So
yeah, I think that's core to why I wanted to write my book Flex, which is two primary dimensions. Number one, the demographics of leaders has changed dramatically. You know, there was a time when the vast majority, and it's still the majority, but it was the vast majority, were white men at the top of a pyramid. And success was being strategic, being directive, being authoritative, having a vision, kind of what we all think of as the archetypal leader. Now, that's still accurate to a certain extent. But in today's world, you have people with many different cultural backgrounds. You have many more women in leadership. You have people of color. You have people from all over the world, globalizing, multicultural. And so the types of folks that are in leadership roles has just exploded in variety. So that's number one. And number two, you have a change in demographics in terms of the generations, right? So we have the millennials and the Gen Zs or Gen Xs coming up, and their style of leadership is not always the same as the traditionalists or the boomers. So there's been fundamental shifts, and that's what I wanted to address.
Well, and there's something else in that is once upon a time, perhaps when you were just getting started, or I know when I don't have the 20 years that you do, but almost, it is coaching still has or had a perception of being remedial. It's Jeff, you're screwing up, you need a coach. And there's still that, but it's become much more aspirational now. Have you seen that? So,
yeah, and I think that's a really good point, is that coaching, when I first started, it was, we need to bring in the shrink, because we need to have somebody fixed, right? This guy's a toxic leader or problem. And before we fire them, we'll give him one more chance. Right. Now it's really almost at the other end of the spectrum. Really, coaching is viewed, just as it always has been in athletics and in other professions, as something that enhances your likelihood of being effective, gets at your potential, and is available, should be available to just about anyone that aspires to be in a leadership role. And these days, that's almost everyone in the organization. So it's now goal-oriented. It's a positive experience for most people. It's something that many of the organizations I work with offer to their employees and to their leaders as a benefit, not as something punitive.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that is, and part of this shift in this is that many well-known CEOs of the past talked about having a coach, and it almost became like the private jet or the Maybach or whatever it was. And so if the CEO openly says he or she has a coach, then, that's okay. So that helped too. So, and I'm glad you talked about what the shifts in leadership. You talked about demographics and things like that. It's fine. And there is that archetype you talked about, old, stale, and pale. And I remember being at
I call it the white knight coming in on
it's exactly. And it used to be his name is slipping me, but he was the last Heisman Trophy winner at Army. And he gave a speech once, and he said the archetype leadership is the British cavalry officer of the 19th century. Well, we know what happened to them. The Charge of the Light Brigade, for one.
The redcoats.
That kind of, but anyway, so that was that kind, and that has completely changed. And I think that there was that authoritative, you used that word, authoritative element of leadership, which is totally different now. And so how do you see that play out, Jeff?
Well, I think it's contextual these days, because there's still a role for authoritative, decisive leadership, especially in an emergency. During the pandemic, we needed people to be decisive. We needed leaders who would take charge. So it's not a either or mindset. But what is important to keep in mind in the last couple of years is that the need for the kinds of things that we call soft skills, emotional intelligence, empathy, vulnerability, humility, the ability to create a psychologically safe space for a team to be creative and innovative and to take risks, learning agility. These are the kinds of things that are going to be key in today's world to get the best out of employees, to have people be engaged, because we have the great change going on right now where people are really looking at their lives and deciding, where do I want to be? What do I want to do? And it's often the leaders who can exhibit this kind of emotional intelligence that will have the following, that will have the engagement. And so therefore, it's not about hard skills versus soft skills or authoritative versus democratic. It's about being able to contextualize your leadership skills to the right environment at the right moment and have a portfolio, have that available to you. Right.
I'm glad you gave that full spectrum answer, because somehow, it's understandable that the sense of being very decisive, not so much decisive, but authoritative in a particular role is somehow bad. But as you mentioned, in times of crisis, a burning bridge, somebody's got to make that decision, But if you're like that all the time, well, then you're going to, you're not going to be surrounded by very many good people. So that's, and so how have you seen, so let's say go back in your early days of coaching, did you ever hear the word humility or vulnerability? Related to, yeah.
I would say it was pretty rare. Yeah.
Yeah, I used to do a little shtick when I said that I would drop it in kind of anecdotally in a presentation. I would say the one thing they don't teach in business school is humility. Well, but actually, I think they do now. So, and which is good. So when you we know the dangers of the top down all the time. What are the dangers of being, say, too consensual in the sense of a leadership? Jeff, how do you see that?
Well, I think anything to one extreme or another can be problematic, right? Mm-hmm. Too much authoritative decisiveness and control and stoicism can lead to people feeling disengaged, disempowered, not feel like they're part of the solution. They feel like they're just being used. Yeah. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're overly consensus driven, if you won't make a decision without getting everyone aligned every time, it takes so much time. It can be very slow. It can appear to be overly bureaucratic, and you can come across as being indecisive. So, it's taking a look at your strengths as a leader and recognizing which is your tendency. This is what I tried to get at in the book. Look at yourself, having a level of awareness through the help of a coach, if possible, or feedback mechanisms, to understand your natural tendency and then look to expand the repertoire. So if you are consensus driven, which is great, then look to those situations where you may need to be a bit more decisive. Be willing to speak up at times when you might want to hold back. On the other hand, if you tend to be very controlling and decisive, and you've already made up your mind, you know the classic leader who says a brainstorming session, but I've already decided.
Well, yep, been there. So,
exactly. So if you're that type of leader, instead of being self-critical, just think to yourself, if I'm looking to get innovation and creativity, I will need to be curious. I will need to develop listening skills. I will need to have more empathy. So it's having the variety. It's having that bandwidth.
One top of mind challenge right now, and it's all over the news every day in the business community, is what was called the Great Resignation. So when you work with senior leaders, Jeff, in many different worlds. So if they come to you and they say, "What do I do about it?" What do you advise?
Well, I think it's a great opportunity for leaders to step back and ask themselves, are they leading from their values? And are they creating an environment that is infused with meaning that connects with the people? In other words, are they doing something in their organization that people feel strongly and emotionally, aspirationally connected to? Because if that's the case, then people will stay engaged. What they've learned through the pandemic and through economic disruption, socioeconomic, all the different disruptions that we've had, is that people will not just stick to a job just for a paycheck anymore. Very rarely. They may if they have to, but it's almost always temporary. But on the other hand, they will stick, they will be loyal, they will be engaged if they feel a personal connection to what they're doing as having value, as having meaning. So the key to the leadership success is to step back as a leader and think about the purpose, the underlying value-driven purpose for your leadership in your organization. And if you can get connected to that personally, and then you can share that with your people, then you should be able to develop an environment of engaged employees.
A key term that you have been using is connectedness, and I often use the word community, but we are in this at minimum, certainly in white collar jobs. This is and is the hybrid environment or the virtual environment. So, what any ideas and best practices do you see for staying connected when we are not physically proximate? So.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that almost all of my clients are grappling with. And the good news is that the answer to keeping people engaged and informed and in participating is not difficult. It's quite simple. The bad news is that it requires a great deal of attention, because virtual spaces are actually just like the real world, only heightened. Mm-hmm. So for example, just to give you a tangible example, if you were the kind of person as a boss who liked to stop by the water cooler or the coffee machine and chat with your employees, and you actually care about how they're doing, and you would say, how are you doing? What's new? What's challenging? What's going well? Very specific questions over coffee. If you did that over coffee, you can do it over virtual. But if you are the kind of boss who just flew by, hi, how's your day? If you did that in real life and you try to do that in the virtual space, it's going to fall flat. So you have to be very specific and very intentional. How is your work? How are you challenged? What's going well? Very specific questions. Check in with people, spend time. But virtual can be very powerful. It doesn't have to be difficult.
Great. You talk about something that's close to my heart because my father used to use it. My father's a physician, now passed on, but he family practice, and he said he loved this. He was very current with all the trends and studied hard, board certified, all that. But he said, I love the art of medicine. And that's something that you talk about, the art of coaching as well as the science of coaching. What does it mean to you, those disparate halves?
Well, like I said, I'm sorry?
No, how do you balance the two, or what does each bring to it? So.
Well, I think when you're talking about leadership or coaching, there's two sides to the coin. There is recognizing that we now have good science for effective coaching and effective leadership. We now have studies, some random control studies, some good qualitative studies that show if you want to develop good habits, if you want to give good feedback, if you want to be a good coach, if you want to have people grow and change and develop, there are ways that work. So that's science-based. That information is available, and we need to leverage it.
Yeah.
On the other hand, working with people as a leader or as a coach is a human connection. And so you're not a robot. You're not an algorithm. You're a human-to-human interaction. And so there'll always be an art. Every single person is unique. And so you bring your heart, your soul, your connectivity, your trust, your beingness to the relationship, whether it's a leader relationship or a coach relationship. And so that's the art, is recognizing that it's a very special, personal, connected way of being with other people. And use the science, but don't just fall back on the science. Bring your humanity. And bringing the two together, you get the best.
Great. No, I love that answer. And it's, in other words, a little bit of both, and know what to use, and knowing which to use when, that's part of the art too. So there's something else in coaching. It's kind of it's an issue with me, and now I'm going to defer to you and your great experience with the Institute of Coaching is, what portion of coaching is self-discovery, facilitating self-discovery, and what portion is giving advice? How do you dissect that, Jeff? So,
well, I would say the vast majority of what you do as a coach should be helping others discover for themselves what works. You're not a consultant, you're not an advisor, you're not even a mentor. A mentor relationship is a form of coaching. But if you're truly a professional coach, then I think the vast majority of your focus is on helping the other person do self-discovery, because it's about helping them find their own answers within themselves. Right. On the other hand, I am not 100% against advice giving in appropriate situations where perhaps you have had an experience as a coach, which would be very helpful to share. Right. But I think the key to success is, number one, realize that the role of the coach is not advice giving. And number two, when you do give advice, to be very mindful. Like, I am now shifting gears, and this is an appropriate moment for me to use the art of coaching to potentially offer advice. But I'm very, very aware of what I'm doing. I'm not doing it mindlessly. The mistake that I think some coaches make is they think that if they are the expert and they therefore are coaching, their goal is to give advice. And I would say coaching is exactly the opposite.
Yeah. No,
but I'm not particularly religious about it.
Right.
Because I do think there are moments in a coaching engagement when advice might be appropriate.
Right. One of the ways I look at it is almost, if you would use the coaching analogy, the consulting analogy, and I will default to something like strategy. You can hire you can hire a consultant to develop your strategy, but how much better is it that consultant helps you develop the strategy, your organization develop the strategy, and then own it and execute it? I think that's a model for coaching, is that if I just tell you, Jeff, here's the 3 things you need to do, that might be appropriate in a specific situation of opening a meeting or a communication, perhaps something like that. But if all I'm doing, if all a coach is doing is lecturing, well, that's more teaching. It's not coaching. Would you totally agree with that? So, yes. Yeah.
Fundamentally, coaching is the first thing you mentioned, helping a partner discover for themselves the path to change.
Right. And that's good. Thank you. So that's a powerful lesson, I think. So you have in your book, Flex, you have a model, or I'll just touch on it, called Fierce. And the first one is, and it gets a lot of attention, is intentionality. What is meant by that, and how can we focus on it? So
intentionality is in the book under the domain of communication style. Mm-hmm. And what I was trying to get at there is that when you want to be an effective leader in your communications, there's a spectrum, as there are with all the domains in the Flex model or the Fierce model, that you, on the one hand, you want to have facts, figures, science, data, right? You want to have your knowledge. But on the other end of the spectrum, you also want to connect with people. You want to be aspirational. You want to have an emotional connection. And so finding that balance between the data and the emotions is an important key to successful communication. And you want to be intentional about storytelling versus fact finding, and use both as a leader at the right moment in the right time.
Now, you opened up something else, which is sort of a hot button with me, and that's that sadly we are in the age of misinformation or even overt disinformation. Right. So the idea of persuasion, how do we connect with people, not just different from ourselves, but are in a different realm of their facts, their opinion? They model opinions as fact. So how do we reach them? Can we reach them? So
well, that's a difficult space to enter into. Yeah. But I think the paradox of the success of the solution is to recognize that entering into someone else's space is not about telling; it's about listening. Yeah. Great. So if you're curious and you're open to hearing where someone is coming from, you may find that there's more alignment between you than you realize. Right. People that are diametrically opposed, like far left and far right, as most sociologists have shown in studies, they tend to be quite similar.
That's exactly true. Yeah, they're fundamentalist on either side. So, yeah, that's the crazy part of it. But and reaching that, and so often that leadership is, I would say, many often it's the art of influence, the art of persuasion, and so you got to have your facts straight. At the same time, what you would say is the connectedness part. So, and giving people a reason to believe in what it is you stand for and why. So,
yeah, making sure that it's in integrity with your values.
And integrity always comes up there, and that's what triggered me on this intentionality, and is the idea of the conditional apology. For example, if I offended you, Jeff, I'm going to apologize. Well, I wouldn't even be thinking of it if I hadn't offended you. And so that's that intentionality, I think. So anyway, Jeff, we were racing through here. We could continue going for a long time, but you're joining us kindly from Amsterdam. So you're 6 hours ahead of where I am. So I'm cognizant of your time. But anyway, so I ask every guest a story about grace. Do you have one you want to share with us? So.
Oh gosh, there's so many. How about if I tell you a quick coaching grace story? Because
the floor is yours, Jeff. We welcome.
Well, we've been talking about kind of authoritative leaders and the change in the leadership landscape. I had an opportunity to coach what would have been considered a very difficult young man. He was a very, very successful technical engineer, being put in his first leadership role. And he was having a very hard time because he's very authoritative, very dictatorial. And he was being asked to have a coach because the team he was working with was very unhappy. Yeah. And make a long story short, they wanted him to get feedback. And so I put together a list of questions, and I said to him, why don't we share these questions with some of the key stakeholders? Anyway, I'll jump right to the punchline because it's such a graceful moment of life shift and change. Because this was quite a difficult guy, to be honest. And he was not really open to coaching when we first started. But he took that piece of paper that had the questions and he took it home to his wife. And over dinner, his wife was looking at it, and his 10-year-old son grabbed it out of her hand, and he was reading it. And he looked at and he said, why does daddy have to have a coach? What is this? I don't understand. And his mother explained, blah, 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 that he needed to get better at being a boss. And his son, his 10-year-old son, just turned to him and said, just tell daddy to be nicer. He's not very nice.
Oh, what a great, wow.
And the very next day, that person came in, that young man came into my office, and he broke down in tears. And he said, I did not realize that my own son didn't really like me.
Yeah.
He said, am I really as bad as all that? And I said, well, we all have to take our lumps. It's an opportunity. And, we all obviously kept working together, and he did a lot of wonderful work. But suffice to say, 10 years later, he is a CEO. And he calls me occasionally to remind me that it changed his life to realize that he could be a good boss and also be a nice human being. It also changed his relationship to his son. And that is grace.
That is grace. And what a great story. And I'm glad you mentioned it, and because so often almost every senior leader I've worked with has had this moment of awareness. Maybe Warren Bennis would call it a moment in the crucible, but it was that time that you're not, as this young man basically was very gifted, but turning people off. And someone said to him, eventually, if you don't change, you're not going anywhere. And fortunately, the young man that you coached had the grace and they say, I got to change. And that takes courage. And I'd like to say grace facilitates courage too.
I totally agree. I was so moved. He was such a sweetheart after that. He loved his son. He still loves his son. And he loved his team. He had just developed a bunch of bad habits.
Right. And But the power is that he was willing to change, look in the mirror and make that. And that takes guts. So that's part of, I think that the other part of the coaching, it's, we're the facilitators of that, helping folks change, but they're doing all the work. And thank you for all the work you do for us as coaches with the Institute of Coaching and researching this and giving us data and pioneering the research and pushing it forward and you're elevating the coaching profession, Jeff. So thank you. So
thank you.
How can people find you? So
a couple of different ways. They can look up the Institute of Coaching, which is instituteofcoaching.org, and they'll find me there and great resources, or at my own website, which is jeffreyhull.com.
Great. Jeff, with that, we will sign out. Thank you very much for your time today, and we'll close out.
My pleasure.